Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Sagan and 6. I've got a really fascinating gentleman to introduce you to tonight. Trevor Parry is his name. He is a tax lawyer. He's an expert in that area, and he's got some really profound and significant views on tax, on government finances, on government, etc. And so we're going to chat about all of those tonight. Trevor was called to the Ontario Bar in 1996. He holds a Bachelor of Law from Queen's University, a Master of Laws in Taxation from Osgoode Hall Law School, a Master of Arts in History from the University of Toronto, and a Bachelor of Art in History from Trinity College at the University of Toronto. He served as a bencher of the Law Society of Ontario from 2019 to 2023. He's very widely published in the area of taxation, the advanced use of life insurance, advanced retirement planning, etc. Welcome to the show. I also understand you're a wine collector, a fanatic Montreal Canadiens fan, and a Toronto resident that now lives in the Niagara region in Ancaster.
Yeah, I'm just we try to dissuade people from throwing us into the Hamilton thing, but technically it's Hamilton. My wife and I and our three daughters bugged out of Toronto 9 years ago. Well, we had two of them at that point, and third one joined us here. And no regrets other than I miss some of the restaurants and occasionally bump into friends when I'm in Toronto, which is pretty regularly. And you're right about the Habs thing. I always tell people, because I speak across the country, that in Montreal we've seen the Stanley Cup in color. So
the Stanley Cup in color sounds good.
Although it's been 30 years, so
I'll let you know that one of my claims to fame is I was in the dressing room in June 10th. Of 1993, when the Montreal Canadiens won the Stanley Cup, and I had champagne poured on my suit that probably looked a lot like the one that you're wearing right now, sir.
Yeah. No, suits are important. I still wear them. I still wear ties. I think I've got about 300 ties, and it's just part of what I do. I like to present gravitas to people. I think it shows respect for the client, and hell, I like dressing up.
Fantastic. You also like imparting your views on government and taxation. So let me ask you, what do you think of the current state of our tax policy in Canada today?
I think tax policy in terms is about the worst I've ever seen it. I'm 56 years old, so I remember the first Trudeau, and I have never seen tax policy promulgated on the basis of class envy, and that's what we've seen since 2015. Characterizing incorporated individuals as tax cheats, trying to perpetrate the single most substantive reform, so-called reform to the Income Tax Act over the summer in 2017, and it continues. So I'm aghast at what they're doing. I hope that, I know the entrepreneurial community in Canada is aghast, and I think a lot of professionals are, but I try to impart to the common man as well that taxation does not have to be like this, that governments can raise the revenues they need, but they don't have to politicize it to the degree they've had, and just talk about some of the monstrous things that they've tried to perpetrate on the Canadian population and business sector in particular.
So you're a tax lawyer, so you're not against taxes, but you're saying it's been politicized.
I'm against egregious taxes, and I'm against profligate overspending and confiscation and all the things that they're trying to do. But taxes are the cost of society, the cost of civilization. If taxes were at a reasonable level, I would, along with most of the accounting and tax legal community, be out of business. So taxes are a necessary evil, and properly implemented, people will pay them without compunction. But we don't have that here.
How do you think it's been politicized? Why do you say it's been politicized?
Well, they're picking winners and losers.
How do they do that?
Well, a lot of the green initiatives, targeting oil and natural gas in this country in particular, the carbon tax, which has arguable efficacy. I characterize the carbon tax as the watermelon tax. It's green on the outside and deepest red on the inside. So there's not a lot of equality or equity, if you will, when you use the parlance of the left in tax policy. They're targeting particular sectors. The rates of taxation are onerous. The levels at which they kick in are onerous. When we travel in the United States, and I'm sure you do the same, you talk to folks down there. But when their top levels of taxation kick in, it's not till near $500,000. They characterize the class enemy of the 1% and that they should pay their quote unquote fair share. Well, 1% in Canada is about $187,000 a year. In the United States, it's at least double that. So unfortunately, the mass population doesn't ask those questions as to what level is the 1% kicking in. And they also discourage an aspirational society. I want people to make as much money as possible and willingly pay a fair level, not an egregious, but a fair level of tax. I think we can do that in this country. Our tax system was created in the 1960s and introduced in 1971 and is badly in need of modernization. And a lot of when they do that, hopefully it's a new government that does it, we're going to, I think, look at a pro-growth, pro-business, pro-Canadian tax act, not what we have now, which is to arbitrarily punish certain sectors of the economy, to punish those who quote unquote earn too much, and to reward certain constituencies, whether they're in the environmental business or other economic forms of identity politics that this government loves to play.
Is the CRA too powerful?
CRA is, yeah, I would argue they are. I mean, CRA in the 1920s, in the 1930s, when the evidential burden was established, so Canadians are probably aware that you're guilty until proven otherwise in tax matters, until you kick it into tax court. And I think that's an outdated principle. The Americans have moderated that and gone to a better, a more fair evidential standard where the government, the IRS, has to prove its case. Now, with a big caveat, it's extremely difficult to beat the IRS too. And I would argue that they are far more vociferous in their penalty enforcement than we are in Canada. But that said, given how much the information CRA can gather on people using algorithms and data points and all these wonderful things, the argument that you need to prove your own case, I think is an outdated idea. Recovering costs against CRA is extremely difficult. You have to effectively prove malice. That's silly. So they know they have all of the resources, and they'll go after all manner of economic entity in Canada. And then you'll occasionally get the scenario where you get a new auditor who thinks they're the new sheriff in town and prove them otherwise. So it's extremely onerous. It's costly. They're your secret silent partner in any business enterprise. And again, I'm not against tax compliance. I have friends at CRA. There's a lot of smart people at CRA, and a lot of people have some pretty good ideas on tax policy at CRA. But where we are right now, this is not pro-business. It's not good for the economy, and it's not good for the psyche of any entrepreneur or professional in Canada.
We're chatting tonight with Trevor Parry. He is a tax lawyer. He's a very opinionated gentleman, and he's got some strong views on our tax policy and our government finances in Canada. We're going to take a break for some messages and be back with Trevor Parry in just 2 minutes. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. We're chatting tonight with Trevor Parry. He is a tax lawyer. He has got a bachelor's and master's in taxation and in history. He is a very strongly opinionated gentleman who has, as his tagline on his website, Leviathan must be stopped. What do you mean? Can you elaborate?
Sure. Leviathan is a biblical sea monster that devoured all. And more probably better known as a 17th century political treatise by Thomas Hobbes. And Hobbes's central concept was that a social contract could be created to underpin a society where the individual would trade their individual freedom in return for safety. And some people still believe that that's a noble exchange. The modern concept of Leviathan is more of the state, the ever-consuming avarice state, which continues to grow. And I think it's characterized by profligate spending, massive regulation, and in our case, corruption and wayward policy. So when I talk about stopping Leviathan. I'm not talking about armed insurrection or anything like that. I believe the best way to do it is starve it. And the best way to starve Leviathan is through prudent tax planning, so that
Starve the beast.
entrepreneurs can, yeah, they starve the beast. I mean, you pay what you have to pay, but not what they tell you have to pay. There are measures that we take that are prudent, sound, tested, established, and the result is that we get people's taxes down while they're alive, and certainly when they pass on.
So let's take let's look at some of these issues. Prolificate spending. Why do you say that?
Well, they've created, I guess, is a $60 billion deficit in the last budget. They're not over their COVID spending, which was already going into that high. They firmly believe this federal government, to an extent the provincial government, believe they can spend their way out of recession. If you've read Keynes, you did spend in recessions, but you saved in boom times, and they were spending like drunken sailors then. They seek to replace the role of the market in many cases, thinking they can do it better. And looking at the
that's your excessive regulation.
Right, excessive regulation, the massive bureaucracy, unchecked. I mean, what terrifies me is, as Leviathan continues to grow, as a father of 3 young daughters, is that when they finish school, and I collected degrees as you listed off, I hope they want to go to school as long as they want to and will. But when they finish, they're going to have 2 choices. One is leave the country, the other is work for government. That's not the kind of Canada that I think you and I grew up in. This is a land, or was a land, of opportunity. Should be again. But when you have such an overarching, all-consuming government, this Gordian knot of regulation, it stifles initiative at a base level. And that's, I think, what we're facing in Canada today.
When did this change? Or has this always been the case?
Government's always been spending money. I think certainly Pierre Trudeau is the first of the modern prime ministers who engaged in reckless spending. It took, Brian Mulroney and then the inspired leadership of Jean Chrétien and Paul Martin to clean that up. I always commend people to read a book by Bob Plamondon called The Shawinigan Fox, in which he decisively argues that Jean Chrétien was probably the most conservative prime minister we've had in the modern history of Canada. He slew the deficit. Paul Martin helped, but he argues that it was Chrétien. Stephen Harper, I think, provided inspired, maybe boring, but inspired leadership to keep things under control. But this, current government, which low on credentials, low on ability, I refer to them as the trust fundians, are so out of touch with base economics and economic initiative, concepts of entrepreneurialism. They think that they can tax it and spend it, and that there are no checks. They look at metrics like debt to GDP, and as long as that stays inside their parameters, they think things are fine. Problem is that we are creating this absolutely monolithic mound of debt that you and I and our children and our children's children and subsequent generations are going to be saddled with. It does have to get paid off. And what are we getting for our money? Are the services that you are receiving proportionate to what you're paying? Is the quality what you want? This is not the German or the Swedish civil service delivering. This is, in many cases, an unemployment alternative. You've just seen that in the recent negotiations with the strike, where the federal civil service has now been given vast powers to stay at home. So there's no signs in this government that there's any sense or any will to actually curtail spending. They had a perfect opportunity in the last budget, and Minister Friedland dropped that ball most thunderously.
But yet, when we don't get our passports dealt with quickly enough, and we stand in a security lineup, at the airport too long, etc., we complain like crazy and demand the government supply those civil servants to solve our problems. And how could the government have stomached a walkout, a strike right now?
Well, this government wouldn't have. I would argue that a leader with some sense of gravitas and a pair of stones should have, channeled their inner Ronald Reagan and said, no, return to work, or the alternative is your termination. We've never tried it. I mean, no political leader in this country will stand up and say they're going to meaningfully cut the civil service. Tim Hudak tried it, and look what happened. Nonetheless, it has to happen. The civil service needs to be trimmed. It could be trimmed through attrition. It doesn't have to be, bloody constraint. We also have to go after some of the baubles. I cut my teeth in the pension world. I've set more IPPs up, or the team that I led has set up more IPPs than anybody in the country. So I know pensions.
What are IPPs?
Individual pension plans. But, we need to look at how pensions are governed in this country. The day of the defined benefit plan, which our fathers might have had in the private sector, is virtually extinct, but it lives on. And there will be blood in the streets if we try to curtail it in the civil service. There is
some of the best are the politicians that have defined benefit
sure.
plans.
Yeah, but in the defense of the politicians, and I mean, I've aspired to it from time to time, regardless of one's political stripe, it's a pretty thankless job. No one likes you, maybe rarely, but no one likes you. And given if they're giving up a professional career, a career in medicine, career in business, I hate to tell the average Canadian, it's a pay cut, and a substantial one. So I'll give them a break. I don't mind politicians having a pension, but I'll tell you that it's more the vast civil service. I mean, some of the folks, we see it at the provincial level, at the municipal level, certainly at the federal level. These dinosaur defined benefit plans, it's simply none of us can ever hope to have. And that goes back to my point about my kids. Are they going to have, is the logical choice going to be go work for government? When are people going to take risks? Canada was built on that basis. People, we're not quite like the Americans, but this country was a stoic country of hardworking risk takers. And unfortunately, we've snuffed that out in the last 8 years.
So there are some examples of bad tax policy that you sent me. Tax on split income?
Tax on split income is part of this egalitarian streak, the political streak of the Trudeau government, where previous to their introduction of this, and this came out of Morneau's ill-fated summer attempt to rewrite the Income Tax Act, there's two things that survived, TOSI as we call it, an attack on passive income saving in your corporation. Well, previous to this, it was commonplace. You couldn't pay dividends to your sub-18-year-old kids. That was the kiddie tax rules, but you could certainly pay your spouse. And if we remember back to 2002, when then Premier McGuinty introduced professional corporation rules, and it was the doctors that brought it forward in Ontario, and other provinces had had it for years, Alberta and BC in particular. When they introduced it, the rules were imperfectly designed, and within 2 years later, they amended the rules to allow practitioner family members to own non-voting shares and receive dividends. So it was an implied agreement that we couldn't pay the doctors more because the public coffers were running low at that point. But we said, listen, we'll let you incorporate and we'll let you income split with your spouse. And then in 2017, Mr. Morneau brought in these silly rules. And as a practitioner, I'll just tell you that they're monstrously Byzantine. Good luck figuring out the TOSI rules. I've been to several seminars, and I can probably tell you how they basically work, but it's yet more compliance headaches and costs for all the business owners and the doctors and the dentists and lawyers and accountants across the province who had this before. And because Mr. Trudeau thinks that we must all suffer equally, it's something out of Dr. Zhivago, I think, that they bring in these silly and overly complex rules.
Yet another one, small business deduction limitations.
Yeah, that's the idea that you can save for your retirement or your rainy day in your corporation, which again was the primary reason that people did incorporate in the professions, because they don't have pensions. I mean, we've set up a couple thousand, as I said, but for doctors and dentists and things like that. But the vast majority of them don't. They save in their corporation. You're able to defer. So now what happens is if you are successful in saving some money, once you have reached $150,000 of passive income in a given fiscal year, you lose access to the small business deduction, which is 12.2%, I think, in Ontario. So the preferential rate on active business. So we're actually punishing businesses for saving money. And it may not just be for the terrible, selfish reason of planning for their retirement. It might be a capital fund to fund expansion, to employ people, all these things that we want. So positive economic goals are being undermined again because of these narrow political views of the federal government that are not even in the mainstream of the Liberal Party of Canada, I would argue.
Why do you say they're not in the mainstream of the Liberal Party of Canada?
I think that most Liberals like being in power, but I do have Liberal friends, shockingly enough, and they harken back to the good old days of Jean Chrétien and Paul Martin, where the national interest was understood to apply to most people. I think that the Trudeau government is so narrowly ideological and dedicated to fanciful concepts of, radical egalitarianism and this stupid Marxist concept of equality of result, and that is exactly what they're promulgating. That it gets in the way of good common sense. Now, there are some very brilliant people in the Department of Finance and in all of this federal civil service and the provincial civil service too, and I think they shake their heads at a lot of this. But it is as you mentioned, I'm a historian. I've read lots of Canadian history. I simply believe that they are so out of step with mainstream Canadian values and Canadian history that they are alien and are a fundamental threat to the growth and economy of the country. Not to mention
alien and a fundamental threat. Those are really strong words to a party that won a government, 2 minority governments in a row and a majority before that.
A majority before that, and a minority government where they did not win the popular vote. And I would argue that if the Conservative leadership had again, let's get back to the concept of stones, if they had, for instance, if Mr. O'Toole, who's a respectful intellectual and served his country in uniform, if he hadn't flip-flopped on his base, would be prime minister today. I think Mr. Trudeau has lost the soccer mom vote. I think people are tired of him and tired of his shenanigans. And if you read anything in the foreign press, you'll see what the rest of the world thinks of him. But I don't believe that they represent mainstream liberal or small c conservative values at all.
Certainly not small c.
Yeah, well, now there used to be. I mean, John Manley was a conservative minded liberal. There's been a few. Paul Martin, I would put in that there, and I think Jean Chrétien to a great extent. For down the center, and that was the great Canadian tradition, right? I think that they've departed from that. I can't think of any.
A lot of people think that it's a fairly left-wing government, and given that they've been supported by the NDP to stay in power, they have to be to a certain extent left-wing. Otherwise, the NDP will defeat them.
Unless they go to the people with a real message. I mean, they can say to the NDP, they could tack back into the center. I don't think it's going to happen with the current prime minister.
Well, what some people say is the biggest problem is that there aren't business-minded people in cabinet, and that the Liberal Party has historically been most successful when it is a partnership between people that may be on the left and business-minded people that are in cabinet. And you mentioned Manley, Rock would be another example, Paul Martin certainly, etc. Even in Trudeau's, Pierre Trudeau's government, there were business-minded people that were in the cabinet, and there aren't that many, if any.
Brian, I don't know if it depends what kind of business. I mean, the Liberal Party has been the traditional party of Bay Street, and they still are. I mean, let's pull no punches. The big banks are much happier with this government than a potential conservative government, and they seem to recruit heavily from them. Main Street, the entrepreneurial class, the aspirational class, the Thatcherite conservatives are conservative. And that's the party of small business, has and continues to be so. This federal government has no compunction on punishing small business, and I think a lot of it is because none of them come from small business. A lot of them, a few of them, this is their first job. They have no street experience. And they are run by a group of ideologues. I mean, how Mr. Butts has managed to place Fingally for so long is deeply upsetting to, I think, a lot of Canadians.
You also mentioned proposed GAR changes. What's GAR and what are the proposed changes?
The general anti-avoidance rule has been kicking around for years, and it was sort of this stopgap or catch-all. Well, if we can't get you with this, we'll get you with GAR. Well, the courts have restricted GAR to a three-pronged test where they had to prove not just a tax benefit, but that was clearly intended to create one, and that a section of the act had been perverted. They're bringing in an economic substance test now, which is so ubiquitous that it catches everything. And this goes back to the old Duke of Westminster case in the 1920s, where the hallmark, the foundation of tax planning is that so long as you didn't violate the act, you could arrange your affairs and pay the tax that came out. Well, that is definitely imperiled with this GAR thing. And I mean, I'm hoping that if we see a new government, that GAR will be addressed and perhaps the penalty issue can be beefed up. But the three-pronged test that they established in its Canada Trust Co. Mortgage versus the Queen, I think that's good law and should stand. We don't need to rewrite GAR. We don't need to create new anti-avoidance sections all the time. You're just going to get the tax community trying to outthink and out-engineer the folks at CRA. It's counterproductive. Have common sense taxation and common sense tax rates, and a lot of this stuff goes away. People get back to building businesses and employing people.
Reportable transactions was another one on your list.
Again, they go through a number of things where you basically have to put things on notice, like using a non-disclosure agreement between clients. When you do that, you immediately bring in the beefed up scrutiny of our friends at CRA. Again, legislation that doesn't need to be there. It speaks to the unwritten rule that they just don't trust you. They don't trust Canadians, and we need our revenue authority to be on board with absolutely enforcing the act, but building a vibrant economy. And it doesn't come from punishing entrepreneurs. Unfortunately, they've lost sight of that.
What are EIFEL rules?
Has to do with the ability to write off interest based on how much debt you're carrying. And I think it really threatens a lot of the real estate development that we see. And if public policy, if a central tenet of current public policy is to address the housing crisis, first of all, I would argue that interest rates at these current rates do not build houses. But again, punishing the builders of homes, the builders of houses, because they're utilizing and rightfully writing off interest costs, I think is a dangerous road to go down.
This is a fascinating critique of our tax system right now. Thank you so much for sharing this. I also understand that you're a specialist in insurance and you have a lot of comments on insurance. So we're going to take a break for some messages and kind of come back, and we're going to talk a little bit about what you think of the insurance industry and how you can use insurance for your financial future and to reduce taxes. Stay with us, everyone. We'll be back in 2 minutes with Trevor Parry, a tax attorney and a very opinionated, smart guy. Stay with us. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. I'm having an interesting conversation tonight with Trevor Parry. He is a very well educated. He's got bachelor's and master's in history, as well as bachelor's and master's in law. And he's a tax attorney specializing in the Income Tax Act. And he also specializes in the use of life insurance in Canada. How can life insurance, sir, be used to reduce tax for entrepreneurs?
If you read between the lines of the Income Tax Act, it's basically encouraged for anyone of substantial or reasonable net worth to utilize it for prudent tax reduction in many cases. Canada has, in my opinion, the most pro-insurance laws and regulations in the G7, and that's fine, because insurance companies are creating giant pools of investments and employing people, and they are providing tax relief. It's the only large-scale tax shelter, if you want to use that term, or tax reduction vehicle that's available to the public as a whole. So in most of my cases, we utilize it prudently. I approach it a little differently than a lot of the folks in the industry. I don't think of myself as an insurance agent first. I'm a lawyer first. I'm very careful to demarcate what hat I'm wearing to avoid any conflicts of interest. But I bring a lawyer's perspective to problem solving, which is, let's objectively dissect this issue. Let's determine where our tax points are, what we're trying to do for the client, what their best wish or what their wishes are. We're involved in a lot of strategic philanthropy these days. It's really the last frontier in tax reduction planning. But insurance becomes an integral part of what we're doing.
So please explain, how do you use insurance to reduce your taxes?
Most of what I do is corporate. I will do some individual stuff. So the most important thing that people must understand when you're looking at insurance is not the death benefit, but the creation of something called a capital dividend account credit. And if anyone's bought or sold houses, they'll know, if they've held them in a corporation, they know that only half the gain is taxable. So it's the same thing in a corporate setting, but life insurance, when it pays into the corporate owner, creates this credit to the capital dividend account, which allows for tax-free capital dividends to be paid out. Now, there are very complex rules on using those and a variety of strategies, which we call post-mortem strategies, to avoid double taxation and all this kind of stuff. But prudently used, we're able to get folks down dramatically, occasionally down to zero in terms of the tax associated with their corporation. So a lot of, and it's not, robber barons that we're necessarily dealing with, or just real estate developers. I do a lot of work with incorporated doctors. And we find that we're able to, in most cases, in corporations of their size, effectively eliminate tax associated with their dying. So they're able to tie up their affairs with a nice bow and make sure that their loved ones got every penny. And again, there's no curveballs. This is prudent, non-aggressive planning. But insurance becomes a critical part of it. It also helps us reduce tax while they're alive because, for instance, when I talked about the loss of the small business deduction because they've saved too much in their corporation, the insurance policies in Canada are exempt from tax. So we can create very robust cash values in them and not run afoul of those rules. And then people can use that insurance during their life. The banks love borrowing against it. So if you and I are of similar age, we remember good old Freedom 55 when interest rates were 21% when they introduced that. And I hope we never go back to that. But that strategy still works. So you can put a policy into your corporation. You save accordingly. You don't, harm yourself or impair your cash flow. You have to do this in an analytical fashion. But you'll create a great war chest of cash value. And when it's time to retire, if you want to, you can utilize that as your retirement vehicle. These things invest very conservatively, largely in fixed income and commercial real estate. One of them owns a big chunk of the 407. So very prudent, well-run portfolios. I think they minimize risk for people who are looking at them. And the wonderful thing is that when they shuffle off the mortal coil, their wishes are executed and the government receives certainly not 53.53 cents on the dollar. Noticeably less, usually well under 20%. So
the life insurance sector doesn't have such a great reputation. What do you think of the life insurance business?
Yeah, deservedly so. I mean, insurance pays very well. No one can deny that. But the problem is, I think like everything, I think we've seen a fundamental degradation in ethics. And I refer to a good chunk of the insurance industry as masters of financial alchemy. And that with the wonderful use of a spreadsheet, they can present this fantastic outcome that is never going to happen. So I think the insurance industry is in need of a strong regulatory enema, as is most the financial sector. I'm a proponent of fiduciary standards.
A regulatory enema?
Oh yeah, well, this is where government can be useful because it's not, the industry is not self-healing. Until I think the vast majority pick up and understand the real ethical standards that need to be implemented, and that's why I favor a fiduciary standard. I think this will continue to go on. If I was a real malevolent SOB, I would just hang out my shingle as a plaintiff's side lawyer, and what would happen next.
Do you think people are leaving Canada because tax rates are so high?
Oh, I know they are. I know
really?
That firsthand. Yeah, I talk to people all the time who are not just thinking about it, they're doing it, and that money's not coming back. It's not just the tax as well. People are. This is, as I said, such a marked difference from any Canadian government, left or right, that we've seen before. I mean, I couldn't stand Pierre Trudeau, but he's night and day from Junior and his ministry. And people are just fed up. Out west, it's even more pronounced. I mean, you have a government of Canada attempting to oppress and impoverish provinces because their primary industry is oil and natural gas. That's un-Canadian.
What would you do with our tax policy in Canada if you were the Minister of Finance or head of the Department of Tax?
If I was painting with a wide brush, I'd say I'd bring in a flat tax system, but it won't happen. I think you have to, there's certain elements that I would take on. I would drop taxes, income taxes dramatically. I prefer consumption-based taxation. So a VAT or an HST or something like that. And prudently implemented, the government should be able to raise most of its necessary funds from that. Income tax still needs to be there, but not this perversion of progressive income tax that we currently have. And it's morally not sustainable for, other than times of war, for people to have to pay more than 50% of what they make. This is one thing I was disappointed with the Premier. There's only 2 provinces in Canada that have a top marginal tax rate of less than 50%. I was hoping Premier Ford, when he was resoundingly reelected, would say, you know what, we're going to go to 48% or 46.41 like we used to have. And I think psychologically that would have been a good message to the business community across Canada. You would see more dollars coming into Ontario. But what substantive changes I would make? Probably change the evidential burden in tax matters, or in tax controversies, we'd say. But I would drop rates.
What does that mean? What does that mean, change the evidentiary matters?
Well, you're guilty till proven otherwise. CRA needs to be restrained. CRA needs to stop bullying people. CRA needs to be an actual partner in the growth of the country, not a bulwark to entrepreneurial spirit. So that has to happen. But in terms of tax policy, we need to become pro-growth. We need to, realize that the rising tide floats all boats. They don't believe that. We need to liberate all of our industries, regardless of what area they're in. I'm a proponent of something called a patent box, which has been done in the UK and some of the EU countries. And so in Canada, we spend a lot of money through tax programs on something called scientific research and experimental development grants. And they're done to pay the salaries of companies that are arguably doing research. Well, very few of these things ever turn into profitable businesses. So it's wasteful. What a patent box says is that when you have intellectual property, be that patents or industrial design and maybe trademark, more likely could be copyright, and they move to a net positive revenue situation, that we are going to tax those business entities preferentially or not at all. And what would happen is that you would see not just experimental development and research, you'd actually see profitable intellectual property developed in Canada. We'd become a research hub. We'd become a bigger version of Ireland. And I think that the trade-off is, the government doesn't get direct revenue from, or less direct revenue from these companies, but look at what would it do to the education system in the country? Because universities would line up to do this because they would become profit centers. What would it do for overall employment? And just over our social cohesiveness? We become a country of doers of things again.
But I thought that was the pitch of Shreds.
It's supposed to be, but Shred for the most part doesn't turn into anything. It pays a salary for somebody to do some research, but that research very rarely turns into anything.
So you're saying that having the tax deduction or the tax credit for expenditures on research is not effective, but lowering the tax rate on the actual innovative patent that starts to create income would be.
Yeah, I believe in the carrot approach. You reward results. So
but you got to wait. You got to wait. In biotech, you'd be waiting 7 to 10 years until such time.
You would. Yeah, you would. And you may not get rid of Shred. You might police it a little more. I mean, it ends up in an audit all the time. But rewarding results, I think, has a much more tangible societal benefit.
Now, my complaint with the Shreds is that you had to pay consultants and auditors way too much money and it took too long to actually get the application approved.
Yeah, there's a small industry that's grown up, but that's
what about flow-through shares, which is another way of getting early stage mining companies.
I love flow through shares. I've done them for years, and there's some very smart people in that space. And once again, because of a political decision, oil and natural gas flow through is no longer available. So it's this picking winners mentality that we get with this current federal government. Bring back flow. Absolutely.
I was arguing and making presentations at one point in time for flow through shares on biotech and pharmaceutical companies. What do you think of that?
I think that's a great idea. Give tax incentives to develop. I have no problem with that. And then further tax incentives once it becomes profitable. Profit's a good thing. It benefits everyone.
Do capital gains deserve a lower tax rate than income?
Absolutely. It's money you already paid tax on it. You're taking risk. Why should it be taxed again and again and again? You know, I can make the case to eliminate capital gains, but I'm fine with 50% of it being taxable. Every year we sit around with our rosary beads 2 days before the budget or the day before, wondering if the inclusion rate's going to go up. There's a lot of reasons I can see them wanting to do that. I don't agree with them. But capital gains, remember that people have to understand you're taking capital you've already paid tax on throughout the development of it, putting that capital at risk to arguably build a business or develop wealth, which has ancillary benefits for all around.
Thomas Piketty, a French economist, wrote a book about capital in the 21st century. And two of his biggest changes were that he thought we needed to have a global taxation system so that you didn't have income going to low tax environments. And the second thing was that he thought we should have a wealth tax. What do you think of those two ideas?
No, negative on both. You already have the first. The OECD has tried to enforce this across the world, the concept of basic or, standard corporate taxes and all that kind of stuff. So the cocktail club of the OECD and the UN is all for that. And wealth taxes, again, you're punishing, you're punishing money capital that's already been created. You're picking on certain industries. We have a wealth tax on, it's not called that, on banks and insurance companies. The share buyback rules are a sort of a stealth wealth tax. They have papers that the Parliamentary Budget Office has created where they talk about tens of billions of dollars that are going to be created. How do you police it? How do you calculate wealth? How do you enforce it? More compliance, more tax, when we should be saying, you know what, we want wealth. We want to encourage it because we know that the ancillary benefits of employment, societal health, and well-being vastly outweigh the meager revenue goals that the federal government thinks it can accomplish through this. And I assure you that the folks in the tax community will find ways to avoid the wealth tax, and others will simply help people to the exits, because that's what will happen.
We're chatting tonight with Trevor Parry. He is a tax lawyer. We're chatting about tax policy in Canada, and we're getting some good ideas about how Trevor would change our taxation system if he had the chance. Stay with us, everyone. We're going to have one last break and come back with some concluding comments in just 2 minutes. Stay with us. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. I'm having an interesting conversation with Trevor Parry tonight. He's a extremely opinionated, smart, articulate lawyer specializing in tax. He was called to the Ontario Bar in 1996. He has a Bachelor of Laws from Queen's University, a Master of Laws in Taxation from Osgoode Hall. He's got a Master of Arts in History from the U of T and a Bachelor of Arts in History from Trinity College. You're a member of the Canadian Tax Foundation, the Society of Trust and Estate Practitioners, Canadian Association of Farm Advisors, the Financial Planning Association of Canada, the Albany Club, the Royal Canadian Military Institute, and the Galt Sportsman's Club. You're an avid wine collector, a fanatic Montreal Canadiens fan, and you're living in Ancaster. What up?
My daughter's big dog named Tex. So.
Fantastic. Taxation. Let's say that I've got a dispute with CRA, and I think I did something right, and they disagree. What do? Call you up?
You do, or I point you in the right direction, but we move you to tax court as fast as possible. Sure, your legal bills might be a little higher, but you have a fair shake there. The Tax Court of Canada has some excellent judges, and the evidential burden, as we spoke about, changes you're not guilty until proven otherwise in tax court. You are in the administrative part of the whole process. So that's what we want to do. We want to get people, if the dollar value is that significant, and usually it is, we want to move them into tax court as fast as possible.
And how do I move into tax court?
You just file notice of objection and then file with the tax court that we have to move it out of the administrative section. So you're usually waiting for the audit or the reassessment process to finish, and then you further dispute it by going to tax court. So there is a period of time, and they're slow, right? I mean, they want to get paid, and usually you have to put some money into the kitty, but definitely that's the route that I prefer, is getting them there as fast as possible.
And do you self-represent, or do you hire a smart guy like you?
I point you in the direction of guys who do nothing but tax litigation, and they're chess masters.
And if people want to get some advice from someone like you, do you have a website? Or
I do. Yeah, it's Trevor at trevorparry.com. Parry with an A. It's the Welsh version. You can see me wear my Churchill bowler and talk about somewhat ideological points of view on tax and business. I mean, no different than what you and I are talking about tonight. But I'm a proponent of freedom and success and initiative and personal responsibility and all those good things that, unfortunately, our friends in Ottawa seem to have forgotten or malign on a day-by-day basis.
So you think that we should all be looking at ways of reducing our taxation?
I think so. I think that, first of all, everyone should, across the board, have lower rates. I mean, Canadians pay, the top bracket in this province, you hit it at $235,000. That's 53.5%. A lot of people think that $235,000 makes you rich. It doesn't. It makes you middle class. I mean, if you live in the GTA, 235 is a good number, but it doesn't go that far. So really, when we look at what this tax policy of this government is directed at, though they espouse to be helping create the middle class, it's quite the opposite. They're punishing the middle class. They have done nothing to assist, I would argue, any taxpayer who isn't working for government or receiving a check. And too many people are, we went through COVID, everyone was getting a check, and we have to wean people off of that. But the rates that people are paying are just simply monstrous. They're stifling. And it is leading to not just a malaise in the business community and entrepreneurial spirit in this country, it's leading to people making for the exits.
Trevor Parry, thank you so much for joining us tonight. I really appreciate it.
Brian, it's been a real pleasure. Thank you for having me on.
So I'm going to end with a couple of points of view of my own, if I could. I think our tax rates are too high. And I'm probably a lot more left-wing than Trevor, as some of my listeners will know. But I think that historically, the Liberal Party and the Conservative Party have been more successful when in government, when they have business people, whether Bay Street or Main Street, business people in cabinet, helpful to make decisions. And I think that our current government currently probably has the fewest people that have got business experience that we've ever had. I can't think of the equivalent of a Paul Martin or John Turner or even a Jean Chrétien that is in cabinet today. And I think that is a problem. Trevor was critical of our former Minister of Finance and some of the tax changes he tried to put in place in 2017, 2018. But he has written a book very critical of the lack of a prosperity agenda, lack of a growth agenda, lack of a productivity agenda in our government today. And I think that's to a certain extent true. And I do think that we need to grow the pie rather than just divide the pie up. And I think that this government is not growing the pie to the extent it should. Our productivity growth is terrible. It's abysmal. Our growth in per capita GDP is non-existent. We've been growing GDP only because of immigration and the growth of the population. We haven't been growing GDP. And one of the things that I get in my job is I travel to the southern United States, Florida and Texas, and they're on fire. And I don't agree with many of the social policies of those two governments, but I got to tell you, they're on fire because of low taxation and low regulation. And it's people from the northeast of the United States, New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, Massachusetts, etc., that are moving whole companies to Florida and to Texas. And they're doing that because of low taxation and low regulation. I think our regulation has gone too far. And I'm not sure if I agree with Trevor's depiction of government as a leviathan that is going to swallow us all up, but it's certainly getting bigger. And this last civil service negotiation, Trevor correctly pointed out, the government looked weak, and agreeing to something that most companies wouldn't agree to in regards to people staying at home and working at home is something that, as I said, most companies wouldn't agree to. So I'm not sure exactly what the solution is. Trevor will probably tell you to vote a different way. I'm going to tell you that I think part of the problem is right now is that we don't have a party of the center. We have a party of the extreme right, and we have a party that has historically been to the center, that has moved to the left. Maybe because it's a minority government, it's being influenced by the NDP, but I think it did it because of the Prime Minister and potentially the Svengali that you mentioned, Trevor, and some of those influences. But I think we have a problem right now with productivity and prosperity and the lack of growth. And maybe Trevor's got a lot of smart things to suggest and recommend for us all. Worth thinking about, even if you're a Liberal. Thank you, Trevor. Really appreciate it.
Thanks so much.
That's our show for today, everybody. Thanks for joining us. I remind you, I'm on every Monday through Friday at 6 o'clock on 960 AM. You can stream me online at www.saga960am, even from Ancaster. And all my podcasts and webcasts are available on my website, briancrombie.com. Good night, everybody.